We're looking at some weather across the Midwest. Possible moderate winds 10 minutes into the flight. I want everyone prepared.
Are we sure that's the right route? I flew yesterday and the northern corridor was completely clear.
I think it.
You know, there are moments in life when everything you've worked for, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dream you've chased, can be stripped away in an instant. Not because you failed, not because you weren't good enough, but because someone looked at you and decided you didn't belong. This is a story about one of those moments. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room where you just knew, that people were questioning whether you deserved to be there? Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you believe that everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, deserves to be judged by their character and competence, hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this one need to be heard. It was a cold March morning in Denver when Captain James Mitchell arrived at the airport 3 hours before his flight to Boston. The kind of cold that bites at your face and makes your breath visible in small clouds. But James barely noticed. He'd done this walk 1,000 times before. The confident stride of a man who had earned his place among America's elite. James was 44 years old, one of only 73 black commercial airline captains in the entire country. Think about that for a moment. In a nation of over 300 million people, only 73 black men commanded commercial aircraft. James knew he was an anomaly, a statistical outlier in an industry that remained stubbornly, overwhelmingly white. But he had earned it. God, how he had earned it. 15 years with Atlas Airlines. 20 years total as a pilot. 12,000 flight hours logged. A spotless record that included commendations from passengers, crew, and management alike. Before that, he'd flown combat missions for the Air Force, navigating hostile skies where one mistake meant death. When people saw Captain Mitchell at the controls, they usually felt safer. They trusted him. They believed in him. Today would be different. As James entered the crew lounge, he immediately noticed something was off. His regular co-pilot, Tom Chen, had called in sick. Food poisoning, the scheduling department said. In his place stood a younger man, white, probably late 20s, with an eager smile and captain's stripes that looked freshly pressed. Captain Mitchell, I'm David Harrison, your first officer today. The young man extended his hand warmly. I've heard incredible things about you, sir. The guys say you can land in conditions that would make other pilots turn back. James shook his hand firmly, appreciating what seemed like genuine respect. Let's hope we don't have to test that today, he said with a warm smile. As they reviewed the flight plan for Atlas Flight 429, James noticed her enter the room. Sarah Morgan, flight attendant, 38 years old with 10 years at the airline. James had flown with her exactly twice before, and both times, something about her had felt cold, distant. He'd chalked it up to professionalism, maybe just her personality. But today, as she walked in, there was something else in her eyes. Something harder. During the pre-flight briefing, James outlined his expectations, the same way he always did. Professional, clear. Authoritative without being harsh. We're looking at some weather across the Midwest, he explained, pointing to the radar images on his tablet. Possible moderate turbulence about 90 minutes into the flight. I want everyone prepared and ready to secure the cabin quickly if needed. Sarah immediately interrupted. Are we sure that's the right route? I flew yesterday and the northern corridor was completely clear. James maintained his composure, his voice steady. The forecast has changed since yesterday. The jet stream has shifted south. Sarah nodded, but she didn't look at him. Her eyes went to David as if the information would somehow be more accurate coming from the white co-pilot standing beside him. David noticed. James could see the flicker of discomfort cross the young man's face. But David said nothing. Any other questions? James asked. Silence. But the tension in the room had shifted like a barometric pressure drop before a storm. You know what's insidious about racism? It's rarely the big dramatic moments you see in movies. It's the 1,000 small cuts, The subtle disrespects. The tiny humiliations that add up until you're bleeding from wounds no one else can see. As they prepared the aircraft, James noticed the pattern repeating. Sarah would direct operational questions to David instead of James, even though James wore the 4 stripes of a captain while David wore 3. When the cabin crew brought coffee to the cockpit, a small courtesy during preparations, David received his exactly as requested. Black, 1 sugar. James's order of coffee with cream came black. "Sorry, I must have forgotten," Sarah said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No problem," James replied professionally. But it wasn't the first time. It was the 3rd time she'd forgotten his preference while remembering David's perfectly. Then James heard it. The voices just outside the cockpit door. Not quite whispering, not quite loud. Sarah and another flight attendant thinking the door would muffle their conversation. "I always get uncomfortable when they put these affirmative action hires in the captain's seat," Sarah said. Her voice carried that particular tone, the one white people use when they think they're being subtle. It's like they care more about diversity photos for the annual report than passenger safety. The other flight attendant's response was too quiet to hear. "I mean, I'm sure he's qualified on paper," Sarah continued. "But don't you wonder if they lowered the standards?" James felt it then, that familiar weight settling on his shoulders. The weight he'd carried his entire career, the weight every black professional carries. The knowledge that you have to be twice as good, twice as professional, twice as perfect. Because one mistake won't be seen as human error. It'll be proof. Proof that you never belonged in the first place. Have you ever had to be twice as good just to be seen as equal? Comment 1 if you know what that feels like. James's phone buzzed, a text from Harold Pierce, his longtime mentor and current CEO of Atlas Airlines. "James, be careful today. Hearing about trouble brewing, watch your back." James stared at the message, a cold unease settling in his gut. In 20 years, Harold had never sent him anything like this. What kind of trouble? And why today? The weather delay stretched from 30 minutes to 90. The terminal grew crowded, passengers grew frustrated, and James could feel the tension building like electricity in the air. He made adjustments to their flight plan, calculating new routes to avoid the developing thunderstorms. As boarding finally began, 2 hours late, James stood at the cockpit door greeting passengers. Most smiled back, appreciative of their captain's personal touch despite the delays. But Sarah was undermining him. An elderly couple expressed concern about the turbulence forecast. Sarah turned to David, who was checking instruments just inside the cockpit. "Don't worry," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Our first officer, Harrison, is excellent in rough weather. He'll make sure we avoid the worst of it." James was standing 3 feet away. She acted like he didn't exist. A businesswoman with platinum status approached James directly. "Captain, will we make up any time in the air? I have a critical meeting in Boston." Before James could answer, Sarah interjected. "Captain Mitchell's route today actually adds 20 minutes to our flight time. Perhaps that's more cautious given the conditions." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Overcautious, incompetent, unsure of himself. The businesswoman's confidence visibly dimmed. Then an older white man in first class did a double take when he saw James's captain insignia. "You're the captain?" The surprise in his voice was unmistakable. "Yes, sir, 20 years now," James replied evenly. The man opened his mouth to say something else when Sarah appeared, all helpful smiles. "Mr. Donaldson, can I get you settled with a pre-departure beverage? Captain Harrison will have us on our way shortly." James felt his jaw tighten. "I'm Captain Mitchell. Mr. Harrison is our first officer." "Oh, of course." Sarah's theatrical embarrassment would have won awards. How careless of me. But the damage was done. Mr. Donaldson was now staring at James with open suspicion. Other passengers had heard the exchange. "Who's really flying this plane?" James heard the man mutter to his seatmate. During final preparations, James discovered something that made his blood run cold. Someone had altered the flight plan loaded into the aircraft's computer. The carefully calculated route he'd created, the one designed to avoid the worst weather, had been changed. These new coordinates would take them directly through the storm system. James checked the system logs immediately. The changes had been made using Sarah's crew tablet login, 20 minutes earlier, while he'd been greeting passengers. When the last passenger was seated, James pulled Sarah aside. "Ms. Morgan," his voice was controlled but firm, "would you explain why you accessed and modified our flight plan without authorization?" Sarah's expression remained neutral, almost bored. "I simply reviewed it, Captain. If changes were made, it must have been a system error. I was just making sure we weren't taking an unnecessarily long route." Modifying a captain's flight plan without discussion isn't about safety. It's dangerous. It's a breach of protocol. David had stepped into the galley during this exchange. His face went pale. "The flight plan was altered? I didn't catch that during my systems check." "It's corrected now," James said. "But I need everyone on this crew to respect the chain of command." Sarah's smile stayed fixed, but her eyes turned to ice. "Of course, Captain. We all want the same thing. A safe flight." James stepped away to make a call. Cameron Brooks, the director of operations, an old friend from his Air Force days. "Cam, something's wrong with this flight. A flight attendant named Sarah Morgan seems to be actively undermining me. She even modified my flight plan." "Sarah Morgan?" Cameron's voice carried immediate concern. "James, tread carefully. Her uncle is Robert Preston. He's on the board of directors. She's got connections you don't want to cross." "So I'm supposed to ignore safety violations because of family connections?" "No, but document everything. Don't give her ammunition. There have been rumors about her. Issues with certain captains in the past." "Certain captains?" James understood the euphemism immediately. "Just watch yourself," Cameron said. "Follow every procedure perfectly, and maybe review your personal records tonight. Make sure everything's in order." The warning chilled James to his core. Why would he need to review his records? What was really happening here? If you've ever been targeted at work because of your race, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is about to get much more intense. 2 hours into the flight, James monitored the weather radar with growing concern. Despite his revised routing, the storm had intensified beyond forecasts. Dark red clusters bloomed across the screen. Severe turbulence. Possible lightning. "We need another course adjustment," James told David, who nodded in agreement. After receiving clearance from air traffic control, James made a cabin announcement. Professional, calm, reassuring. But Sarah burst into the cockpit without knocking. "Why are we changing course again?" she demanded. "We're already late, and now you're adding more delay." "We're avoiding severe weather, Ms. Morgan," James explained. "It's standard procedure." Sarah leaned over to look at the radar. "That doesn't look so bad. I've flown through worse with Captain Henderson last month." "Every weather system is different, and I'd appreciate it if you'd follow proper cockpit entry procedures." Sarah left without closing the door completely. Her voice carried into first class. "Another unnecessary delay, folks. Apparently we're taking the scenic route to Boston today." Several passengers looked up with concern. One began typing rapidly on his phone, a travel blogger James had recognized during boarding, sharing Sarah's commentary with thousands of followers in real time. Then the call came from the rear of the aircraft. "Captain, medical emergency. Row 26. Elderly male, chest pains, difficulty breathing." James immediately began calculating diversion airports while coordinating the medical response. He patched a nurse through to a ground-based physician, prepared for an emergency landing, administered oxygen and medication from the medical kit. Throughout this dual crisis, weather and medical emergency, James demonstrated flawless command, never raising his voice, ensuring every action was taken promptly and correctly. The passenger stabilized. The physician advised continuing to Boston where advanced care awaited. But Sarah was already reshaping the narrative. James overheard her in first class serving drinks. Such a shame the poor man had his episode right when we hit that rough air. If we'd stayed on our original route instead of all these detours, we might have missed that turbulence entirely. The implication was clear. James's decisions had somehow caused the medical emergency. It was absurd. But James could see passengers nodding in apparent agreement. David finally spoke up when Sarah entered the cockpit with meal trays. "That was inappropriate. What you said to the passengers. The captain's decisions had nothing to do with that gentleman's condition." Sarah's smile remained pleasant. Her eyes flashed warning. "I'm just making conversation, First Officer Harrison." She leaned closer. "Your performance review is next month, isn't it? Captain Rodriguez speaks very highly of your potential. Would be a shame if anything derailed your track to the left seat." The threat hung in the air. David's face flushed, but he stayed silent. The approach into Boston was textbook. Clear skies, minimal crosswind. Despite everything, James executed a flawless landing. But as they taxied to the gate, James noticed unusual activity. 3 security vehicles, multiple airline management personnel. Something was very wrong. Atlas 429, proceed to gate C-17. Security personnel will meet your aircraft. "Any reason for the security presence?" James asked, concern creeping into his voice. "Not provided, Captain." When they pulled into the gate, James saw them. Security officers. The station manager. Federal agents, maybe? All waiting. As passengers prepared to deplane, the cabin door opened. 2 airport security officers entered with the Boston station manager. "Captain Mitchell, please step out here immediately." James emerged from the cockpit, maintaining his composure despite the knot in his stomach. Then Sarah stepped forward dramatically, loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "That's him. I've discovered evidence that Captain Mitchell falsified his route calculations and possibly his credentials. I believe he endangered this entire flight." Phones came out. Passengers started recording. "Ms. Morgan has provided documentation raising serious concern, Kate," the station manager stated. "You need to come with us for questioning." "What documentation?" James demanded. "I've done nothing improper." Sarah held up a forged flight calculation sheet. "This routing would have taken us directly through the storm center, and the signature doesn't match your credential verification forms." It was absurd. The route they'd actually flown was perfect. But Sarah had created just enough doubt. David stepped forward. "There's been a mistake. Captain Mitchell's performance was exemplary." But his voice was drowned out by the growing commotion. "Sir, please come with us," the security officer insisted, moving toward James with a hand near his restraints. "Am I being detained?" James asked, acutely aware of the cameras recording everything. As James was escorted through the terminal, security flanking him like a criminal, passengers filmed. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Fake pilot." "Security threat." Behind him, David was trying to explain to the station manager that something was wrong. But he was being systematically ignored. The decision had already been made. Captain James Mitchell was guilty until proven innocent. Maybe not even then. Comment justice if you believe in fighting back against false accusations. And subscribe, because you need to see what happens next. James sat alone in a windowless room. Harsh fluorescent lights, a metal table, his captain's credentials and phone just out of reach. 45 minutes passed, a deliberate tactic. Let anxiety build, break down composure. But James had been through worse. Much worse. Finally, the door opened. Officer Dennis. James recognized him now. 3 years ago, this same officer had pulled James out of the crew line for additional screening despite his captain's uniform, made him miss his departure, asked questions no white captain ever faced. With Dennis came Thomas Barrett, legal compliance manager, and another security official. Captain Mitchell, Barrett began, emphasizing the title with barely disguised skepticism. We need to discuss serious allegations from senior flight attendant Morgan. I'd like to contact Atlas Operations first. This is based on fabricated evidence. That won't be possible right now. Ms. Morgan has provided documentation suggesting irregularities with your calculations and possibly your credentials. Barrett placed the forged document on the table. James examined it without touching it. This isn't my handwriting. This is a forgery. Officer Dennis scoffed. Everyone says that. Ms. Morgan has given an extensive statement, Barrett continued. Multiple instances where your decisions raised safety concerns. That's false. First Officer Harrison was in the cockpit throughout. He can confirm every decision I made was correct. We'll speak with First Officer Harrison separately, Barrett replied dismissively. Ms. Morgan is a highly respected senior crew member with an unblemished record. And I am a captain with 20 years of exemplary service, James countered. Why does her word automatically outweigh mine? The question hung in the air, its implicit accusation making Barrett shift uncomfortably. Let's discuss your credentials, Dennis interjected, picking up James's pilot license. Miss Morgan suggests there may be irregularities. My credentials are completely in order. We'll need to verify that. In the meantime, you'll remain here. I want to contact a lawyer, James stated firmly. Dennis raised his eyebrows. A lawyer? If there's nothing to hide, why would you need an attorney? Because my rights are being violated based on false accusations. Requesting legal representation doesn't look good, Captain, Barrett said. It suggests consciousness of wrongdoing. It suggests I understand my rights, James corrected, and I'm exercising them. The discussion continued as if James weren't present. Station managers appeared, more concerned about PR than justice. James would be suspended pending investigation. He needed to surrender his credentials. On what grounds? Standard procedure when safety allegations are made, Barrett replied smoothly. But it was personal. Deeply, intentionally personal. As suspension paperwork was placed before him, James made his decision. He would sign nothing, say nothing. Until he made one phone call, not to his family, not to a lawyer, to someone whose voice could cut through this entire charade. I'm entitled to one phone call, James stated firmly. 5 minutes, Dennis conceded reluctantly. Supervised. I need privacy. It's to my attorney. When they finally left him alone with his phone, James didn't hesitate. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 5 years but had memorized for moments exactly like this. The phone rang 3 times. Richardson, answered a commanding voice. General, this is Captain James Mitchell. Sir, I apologize for the unexpected call, but I'm invoking Cobalt Protocol. Brief pause. Location and situation, son. Boston Logan, Security Office. Detained under false accusations regarding pilot credentials and performance. Orchestrated attempt to end my career, sir. Understood. Stand fast, Captain. 15 minutes. The call ended. James set down the phone as Officer Dennis opened the door. Time's up, he announced with satisfaction. Your lawyer coming to save you? Something like that, James replied calmly. What Dennis couldn't know was that the man James had just called wasn't an attorney. General Thomas Richardson was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, the principal military advisor to the president. 12 years earlier, Then Major James Mitchell had been flying a classified mission over Afghanistan when their aircraft took enemy fire. With exceptional skill, James had executed a perilous landing in hostile territory. Then, with extraction delayed by weather, he'd led a defensive operation that saved everyone aboard, including then Colonel Richardson. The mission remained classified, but the bond between the two men was unbreakable. Cobalt Protocol was their private arrangement, an emergency code never to be used lightly. In 12 years, James had never invoked it. Until today. Hit that subscribe button because what happens next will shock you. Exactly 14 minutes after the call, Barrett's phone rang. The change in his expression told James everything. Yes, sir. Yes, he's here. No, sir, I wasn't aware of his background. Yes, sir. Immediately. Barrett ended the call looking pale. That was the FAA regional administrator. They're sending representatives immediately, and... He swallowed hard. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's office called them directly about this matter. Dennis looked stunned. The Joint Chiefs? What the hell? I have no idea, Barrett admitted, his earlier confidence evaporating. But we've been instructed to return Captain Mitchell's credentials immediately and treat this as a top priority national security matter. Within minutes, the atmosphere transformed completely. James's belongings were returned with awkward apologies. The station manager reappeared with a completely different demeanor. Captain Mitchell, there appears to have been a serious misunderstanding. We deeply regret any inconvenience. Inconvenience? James repeated coldly. You publicly removed me from my aircraft, detained me, threatened my career, damaged my reputation. That's considerably more than an inconvenience. The door opened. Two stern-faced FAA officials and a military aide in full-dress uniform entered. Captain Mitchell, the aide addressed him directly. General Richardson sends his regards. These officials will conduct an immediate investigation. The general has requested you remain in Boston until this is resolved. A hotel suite has been arranged. The security officers who'd been so dismissive now stood awkwardly silent. Ms. Morgan needs to be interviewed immediately, James stated firmly. She deliberately fabricated evidence and made false accusations. Ms. Morgan will be located and interviewed immediately, an FAA official confirmed. Sarah was celebrating with sympathetic crew members when her phone rang. What the hell did you do? Her uncle's voice was harsh, panicked. Do you have any idea who Mitchell is connected to? What are you talking about? Everything went according to... He made one call to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The FAA is all over this now. They're looking for you specifically. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. He's just a diversity hire. Well, he's not. Get back to the airport immediately. Stick to the story that you genuinely believe there were irregularities. Claim good faith, not deliberate fabrication. As Sarah rushed back, James was being escorted to a luxury hotel suite. Alone finally, James allowed himself a moment to process. Relief at his vindication, tempered by the knowledge that someone had orchestrated a sophisticated attack on his career. He called his neighbor in Denver. James, someone broke into your place today, his neighbor reported. The police came, but whoever did it was gone. They tossed your home office pretty thoroughly. James felt ice in his veins. The timing couldn't be coincidental. A message from an unknown number. Atlas HQ tomorrow, 9 a.m. Board representatives present. Come alone. Tomorrow, James would face the real power behind Sarah's attack, and they would be fully prepared. Atlas headquarters occupied the top floors of a gleaming Boston skyscraper. James arrived at 8:45 a.m., dressed in his full captain's uniform despite being technically on leave. He understood the psychology of it. Present himself as the professional he was, not someone defending against accusations. The Horizon conference room featured floor-to-ceiling windows with panoramic harbor views. But more telling was who waited inside. 8 executives, all white, all male, all in identical dark suits, sitting along one side of a massive mahogany table. This wasn't a discussion, it was a tribunal. "Captain Mitchell, thank you for joining us," began Calvin Foster, Atlas's chief operating officer. "Please have a seat." James took the single chair positioned opposite the row of executives. The power dynamic was deliberate. "I understand there was some confusion yesterday regarding Flight 429, Foster continued with corporate understatement. "Is confusion how you characterize the fabrication of evidence against a senior captain and his public removal based on false accusations?" James asked calmly. Foster's smile tightened. "We're still gathering facts. Ms. Morgan raised legitimate safety concerns that required immediate action." "And has First Officer Harrison provided his perspective?" He witnessed Ms. Morgan's behavior firsthand. Brief glances among the executives told James that David had indeed given testimony, and it likely hadn't aligned with Sarah's version. A large screen flickered to life, revealing Robert Preston, board member and Sarah's uncle, joining remotely. "Gentlemen," Preston began without acknowledging James, "this situation raises concerns that cannot be ignored. Perhaps administrative leave would be appropriate." "Administrative leave based on what evidence, Mr. Preston?" James asked directly. "The forged document has been proven fraudulent by FAA investigators." Preston's expression hardened. "There are broader concerns about judgment and compatibility with Atlas's operational culture." "Please elaborate." Instead of answering, Preston changed tactics. "Your military record is impressive, Captain, though one wonders if the same accommodations made for diversity initiatives in the armed forces influenced your rapid advancement." The insult was both clear and calculated, questioning whether James's achievements were merit-based or affirmative action. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. None challenged the insinuation. "My record speaks for itself," James replied evenly. "As does my performance over 20 years. Perhaps we should review passenger satisfaction ratings for my flights compared to company average." "Statistics can be manipulated," Preston dismissed. "What concerns me is the pattern of incidents where you've claimed discrimination when faced with standard oversight." Now James understood their strategy. Paint him as someone who played the race card to avoid scrutiny. "Please identify these incidents specifically," James challenged. Foster interjected. "We're getting off track. Our suggestion of administrative leave with pay is quite generous." "Generous?" James repeated. "You're suggesting I accept punishment for proven false allegations." James decided to change tactics. He removed a folder from his briefcase. "I've compiled some interesting statistics about Atlas. In the past 5 years, 7 black pilots have been pushed out following disciplinary actions. In each case, initial complaints came from the same group of flight attendants, including Ms. Morgan." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Additionally, despite public commitments to diversity, the percentage of black pilots has actually decreased over the past decade. Preston's face reddened on screen. "Where did you obtain this information? These are internal personnel matters." "I've been building these statistics for years, Mr. Preston. Black aviation professionals share information about which airlines genuinely support diversity and which pay lip service." Before Preston could respond, the conference room door opened. A young black woman in an Atlas flight attendant uniform entered tentatively. "I apologize for interrupting," she said. "I was told to deliver these documents to Captain Mitchell immediately." She handed James a sealed envelope. No one had authorized this interruption. "Thank you, Ms." James read her name tag. "Williams." "Zoe Williams, sir," she confirmed with a subtle nod that conveyed more than courtesy. As she turned to leave, she whispered, "Check your email right away." The interruption had broken Preston's momentum. James seized the opportunity. "Gentlemen, let me be clear. I will not accept administrative leave or any punitive measure based on false accusations. The FAA is investigating Ms. Morgan's actions, and I've filed formal complaints." "Are you threatening this airline?" Preston demanded. "I'm stating facts, Mr. Preston. Facts supported by evidence." The meeting continued for another hour, increasingly tense as James refused any arrangement implying wrongdoing. During a break, James checked his email as Zoe had suggested. There he found a message from an anonymous address containing internal Atlas documents, including a list categorizing pilots by race with troubling notations next to minority names. More damning were email exchanges between Sarah and other flight attendants discussing strategies for documenting concerns about specific black pilots. Zoe had been secretly collecting evidence for months. James's phone buzzed with a text from General Richardson. Preston's financials show connections to pilot schools sued for discrimination. Kite pressing, reinforcements coming. When the executives reconvened, they found James transformed. No longer just defending himself, now armed with evidence of systemic discrimination. The power dynamic had shifted, though none of them yet realized how dramatically. If you believe in exposing systemic discrimination, hit that like button and subscribe for part 11, where everything comes crashing down. James's hotel suite became a command center. What began as a meeting with Zoe Williams evolved into something more significant. An informal coalition of minority Atlas employees who had suffered in silence, now united. "I never thought I'd meet you in person," admitted Marcus Turner, a maintenance supervisor repeatedly passed over for promotion. "You're kind of a legend among black aviation professionals." "I'm just a pilot trying to do my job," James replied modestly, recognizing the responsibility that came with visibility. Zoe methodically organized evidence on her laptop. At 28, she radiated quiet determination. "Sarah didn't just target you, Captain," Zoe explained. "I've documented 6 other black pilots forced out after she filed complaints. Always the same pattern. And her uncle makes sure the outcome is what she wants," added Carlos Rodriguez, a dispatcher. "What made you start collecting evidence?" James asked. Zoe paused, her expression darkening. "My father was a pilot in the 90s. He faced the same systematic push-out. He fought alone and lost everything. Job, reputation, eventually his health. I promised myself I'd never stand by and watch it happen again." A knock at the door. James checked the peephole, surprised to see David Harrison, his first officer. "I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner," David began. "They kept me in debriefings for hours trying to get me to corroborate Sarah's story." "Did you?" James asked directly. David shook his head emphatically. "No, sir. I told them exactly what happened. Your flying was exemplary, but..." He hesitated. "I don't think they wrote down everything I said." "They didn't," Zoe confirmed. "I have access to the interview transcripts. Your statements were heavily edited before being added to official records." David looked shocked, then angry. "They can't do that." "They've been doing it for years," Carlos responded. James studied David thoughtfully. "You're taking a risk being here? Why?" David straightened. "Because what happened was wrong, sir. I froze on that flight. I let Sarah bulldoze you because I was afraid. I won't make that mistake again." As evening progressed, more employees arrived, some in person, others virtually. They shared stories, compared notes, built a comprehensive picture of troubling patterns. "It's not just Sarah," explained Priya Patel, a veteran gate agent. "She's part of an informal group that calls themselves Traditional Aviation Values. They're dedicated to keeping aviation the way it's always been." "Which means white and male," Marcus added bluntly. James's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Multiple victims identified across 3 airlines. Same MO. Preston connection confirmed. The pattern was becoming clearer. This was larger than one flight attendant or one airline. As they continued mapping connections, Carlos received an alert. Captain, you need to see this. The headline made James's stomach tighten. Disgraced pilot's military record questioned. The article contained fabricated stories about James's service, including reprimands that never occurred. They're escalating, James observed grimly. This isn't about pushing me out anymore. They're trying to destroy my entire reputation. Zoe received a text. They've vandalized your home. Racial slurs spray-painted on your garage. The room fell silent. You need protection, sir, David said. James nodded, already texting General Richardson. His phone rang with a Washington area code. Captain Mitchell, this is Andrew Phillips, Atlas CEO. I want to personally assure you I'm looking into the situation. James put the call on speaker. Will your investigation include Robert Preston's role in targeting minority pilots across multiple airlines? Telling pause. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Including his financial interests in pilot schools that have systematically excluded minority candidates. Longer pause. I think we should continue this conversation privately. Perhaps we could meet tomorrow. I'll have my attorney contact your office, James responded, ending the call. He's fishing, Zoe observed, trying to determine how much evidence you have. By midnight, their coalition had grown to 15 people. They identified other victims, all following the same pattern, all connecting to Preston's sphere of influence. As others departed, James received a concerning text from David. Being followed. Black SUV, tinted windows. Minutes later, Zoe's Atlas email access was revoked. Carlos's scheduling system login disabled. They know we're organizing, James concluded. They're moving to isolate us. Tomorrow would bring the real confrontation, and the forces against them were mobilizing too. James sat across from Andrea Chen, a respected aviation journalist who'd flown in specifically to meet him. Captain Mitchell, what you're describing is explosive, Andrea said after their 2-hour interview. Systematic discrimination, coordinated efforts, falsified records. Are you certain you want to go public? The industry will close ranks against you. James's attorney had advised against media. Pursue legal channels first, he'd said. But the vandalism, the surveillance, the attacks, they couldn't afford to wait. Miss Chen, this isn't about saving my career anymore. Pilots have already lost their livelihoods. Qualified candidates never got their chance. This has to stop. I'll need to corroborate everything. Other sources, documentation. You'll have it. But my allies are risking their jobs. Their identities must be protected. Within 48 hours, Andrea's article appeared in Aviation Professional Quarterly. Systematic discrimination. Alleged at major airlines. Veteran captain exposes coordinated effort to remove minority pilots. The article was meticulously researched and measured in tone, but its content was devastating. It detailed the pattern of targeted harassment, the role of Sarah Morgan and her uncle Robert Preston, and broader implications for the industry. The story exploded beyond aviation circles. Major news outlets picked it up. Social media amplified the conversation. Flying While Black trended nationally. Atlas's initial response was corporate damage control. Atlas Airlines takes allegations of discrimination extremely seriously. We are conducting a thorough investigation. Diversity and inclusion are core values. But behind the scenes, Robert Preston orchestrated a vicious counterattack. The first salvo came as selectively edited cockpit recordings from James's previous flights. Though airline protocols strictly protected such recordings, someone with high-level access had extracted snippets of James's voice and spliced them together to make him sound unprofessional and temperamental. These doctored recordings leaked to friendly media outlets with headlines questioning James's judgment. Is this the man you want flying your plane? Atlas released a carefully worded statement that distanced itself from the leak while giving it credibility. While we cannot comment on unauthorized recordings, Atlas takes all questions about pilot temperament seriously. James recognized the strategy: transform a clear case of racial discrimination into a debate about his personal fitness. Classic misdirection. The pressure intensified. Vehicles followed him. His email was hacked. Private conversations appearing in selective leaks. His financial records were mysteriously accessed, with questions raised about how a pilot could afford his investments. Subtle implications of impropriety. Zoe Williams was suddenly fired for unrelated infractions that hadn't been issues during her 5 years of service. The message was clear: stand with Mitchell, pay the price. David Harrison faced intense pressure too. Management called him for follow-up interviews, each time pushing him to sign statements contradicting his earlier testimony. "You've got a promising future, David," a senior vice president told him. "Don't throw it away for someone who's on his way out. Just sign the statement saying you weren't in position to observe all interactions. That's all." Public opinion began to waver as Preston's media campaign gained traction. The edited recordings created doubt. Social media debates became divided. Even some initial supporters distanced themselves, unwilling to become collateral damage. General Richardson remained steadfast but cautioned. "This is becoming corporate and civil, James. My authority only extends so far. These people play by different rules." Then came Preston's offer. Conveyed through intermediaries, a substantial financial settlement in exchange for James's resignation and a non-disclosure agreement. The package would ensure James never needed to work again, provided he dropped all allegations and admitted to misunderstandings. Take the money and disappear. For a moment, James considered it. The toll was wearing on him. The stress, the invasion of privacy, damaged relationships. But then he remembered Zoe's father, who had fought alone and lost. He thought of pilots already pushed out. He recalled the racial slurs on his garage. The settlement wasn't generosity, it was an attempt to purchase his silence. Accepting it would mean everyone who stood with him had risked their livelihoods for nothing. James sent his response through his attorney. Captain Mitchell rejects any settlement, including non-disclosure or requiring withdrawal of allegations. The truth is not negotiable. Preston's response was immediate and ruthless. The next day, James received notice that his pilot's license had been temporarily suspended, pending psychological evaluation regarding his fitness to command an aircraft. The message was clear. Preston would use every connection, every lever of power, every dirty trick to ensure James Mitchell never flew commercially again. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed James was fighting to save his own career. In reality, he was fighting for something much larger, a reckoning that was long overdue. The suspension should have been James's breaking point. Without his license, he couldn't fly for any airline. The psychological evaluation order was particularly insidious, a common tactic against whistleblowers designed to suggest mental instability. Yet instead of crushing him, this attack only reinforced his determination. In his hotel suite, James continued building his case with remaining allies. Their numbers had dwindled, but those who stayed were fully committed. "Captain Mitchell?" The voice came from the hotel phone. "This is front desk security. Someone here insisting on speaking with you. Won't give his name, but says it's regarding Atlas IT systems." James exercised caution. "Tell him I'll meet him in the lobby." 15 minutes later, James sat in a corner of the busy lobby, positioned to observe all entrances. A nervous-looking young man in his early 30s approached, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "Captain Mitchell, I'm Derek Simmons. I work in Atlas's IT security department." James studied him carefully. "How can I help you, Mr. Simmons?" "It's how I can help you," Derek replied, voice barely above a whisper. "I've been monitoring system access logs. Someone's been going through your records, altering data, creating false documentation retroactively." "Sarah Morgan." "Higher up. I've traced access to terminals used exclusively by executive management. Derek glanced around nervously. There's more. Ms. Morgan has a history of filing reports specifically targeting minority crew members. The pattern is obvious once you look. Can you prove this? Derek nodded, sliding a flash drive across the table. Deleted emails between Morgan and her uncle. They were removed from the server, but our backup system retained copies. They explicitly discuss maintaining traditional standards in pilot hiring and promotion. James stared at the drive. Why are you helping me? You're risking your job. Derek's expression hardened. My brother was a pilot for American. Dark-skinned Latino. He faced the same systematic push-out 5 years ago. Preston was on their board then too. My brother never recovered professionally. He stood to leave. Check your secure email in an hour. I'll send more documentation. This unexpected alliance opened a flood of new evidence. Derek provided server logs showing systematic review and alteration of James's records, dating back months before Flight 429. Most damning were emails between Sarah and Preston explicitly referencing their efforts to maintain standards and preserve aviation culture. Thinly veiled references to keeping cockpits white and male. Documents showed Preston's financial connections to 3 major pilot training companies, all with suspiciously low admission rates for minority candidates. With Derek's help, James and his allies mapped a network of influence extending far beyond Atlas. Preston had systematically placed like-minded executives throughout the industry, creating a nearly invisible barrier to minority advancement. James divided evidence into 3 secure packages, one for his attorney, one for Andrea Chen, one for the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights. Each contained enough to launch investigations, but not the complete picture. Ensuring information would survive even if one package was intercepted. What James didn't know was that Preston had already learned of the IT security breach. Within hours of Derek's meeting with James, Preston's network identified the source. Derek was fired immediately, escorted from headquarters by security while colleagues watched in stunned silence. His devices were confiscated. Lawyers presented him with threatening documents alleging violation of confidentiality and theft of proprietary information. Preston moved quickly to contain damage. Through connections, he arranged for a federal judge to issue a temporary restraining order against James, prohibiting dissemination of confidential Atlas information. Papers were delivered threatening prosecution under computer fraud and corporate espionage statutes. Simultaneously, Atlas's legal department sent cease and desist letters to Andrea Chen and her publication, claiming her article contained false and defamatory information and threatening ruinous litigation. HR contacted every employee known to have communicated with James, reminding them of confidentiality obligations and legal consequences of violations. Most distressing was notification that James's license suspension had been extended, with evaluation requirements expanded to include additional psychiatric assessments. That evening, as James reviewed legal threats with his attorney, he received texts from his allies. Zoe had been served with legal papers at her home. David Harrison had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Carlos from Dispatch found his access cards deactivated. One by one, Preston was neutralizing everyone connected to James's case. James's attorney delivered harsh reality. They're using corporate resources to bury you in legal proceedings. Even with pro bono representation, you're facing years of litigation. Most of your witnesses are being intimidated into silence. Without them, documents alone won't be enough. For the first time since this began, James felt the full weight of what he faced. Not just one airline or one executive, an entrenched system with decades of practice protecting itself. As night fell, James stood at his hotel window looking out at city lights. Allies were being picked off. His credentials were under attack. Legal threats mounted daily. The system was demonstrating exactly why discrimination persisted. No one could withstand the combined pressure of corporate power, regulatory influence, and legal intimidation. All appeared lost. But as James had learned during his military career, sometimes the moment when defeat seems most certain is precisely when one must execute the most audacious strategy. And James had been developing such a strategy from the moment he realized the true scope of what he was fighting. Tomorrow would determine whether that strategy would lead to total defeat or an unprecedented victory that could transform the industry forever. Have you ever felt like giving up when fighting for what's right? Comment, never give up, if you believe in persisting even when the odds seem impossible. The morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Atlas had scheduled what they termed a conclusive review of Captain James Mitchell's case. In reality, everyone understood this was the formal execution of his career, the carefully orchestrated termination of a pilot who dared challenge the system. Corporate headquarters gleamed in morning sun as James arrived, dressed impeccably in his full captain's uniform despite his suspended status. Security guards eyed him with curiosity and weariness. "Captain Mitchell," the receptionist greeted him with professional detachment. "The boardroom is prepared. 14th floor." The boardroom was arranged like a courtroom. On one side sat an impressive array of executives and legal counsel. Robert Preston occupied the central position, having flown in specifically for this occasion. His presence signaled the importance he placed on personally witnessing James's professional demise. "Captain Mitchell," Preston began with false cordiality. "We appreciate your promptness. This proceeding is being recorded for internal purposes. Do you have legal representation?" "I represent myself," James replied evenly, taking his seat at the solitary table positioned across from the corporate phalanx. Preston raised an eyebrow. "As you know, this hearing will determine your employment status following numerous concerning incidents culminating in Flight 429. James noted the plural, incidents, continuing their strategy to paint him as problematic rather than addressing specific false accusations. "For clarity," Preston continued, "we'll begin with testimony from Senior Flight Attendant Sarah Morgan." On cue, Sarah entered, dressed conservatively in uniform. She carried a portfolio and wore an expression of practiced professionalism, tinged with apparent reluctance, as if an unwilling participant forced by conscience to testify. "Ms. Morgan, please describe the events that caused concern during Flight 429. Sarah launched into her rehearsed narrative. James was agitated, defensive, erratic. His weather decisions were unnecessary and potentially dangerous. He'd been dismissive of crew input. She'd discovered calculation errors raising serious concerns about his preparation. "And this wasn't the first time you'd observed such behavior?" "Unfortunately, no," Sarah replied with feigned regret. "I've noted similar incidents on previous flights, though never quite as concerning." James observed her performance with clinical detachment. The lies were expected. What interested him more was executive body language. Most avoided eye contact, focusing on notes or on Sarah. Only Preston watched him directly, a slight smile playing at his lips, the smile of a man believing victory was assured. As Sarah continued, occasionally referencing documents from her portfolio, James's phone vibrated silently. A single text from an unknown number. In position. Timing was perfect. Sarah had just claimed under oath that she'd never targeted other minority pilots with similar accusations. A direct lie? "Do you have questions for Ms. Morgan, Captain Mitchell?" Preston finally asked, clearly expecting either emotional outburst or futile denials. "Just one," James replied calmly. "Ms. Morgan, are you aware that this entire proceeding is being monitored by federal investigators from the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General as part of an active investigation into discriminatory practices at Atlas Airlines?" The room froze. Sarah's composure cracked visibly, eyes darting to her uncle. "That's absurd," Preston declared, though uncertainty had entered his voice. This is a private corporate disciplinary proceeding. Is it? James asked, standing to his full height. Because for the past 3 weeks, I've been working directly with federal transportation investigators, building a case about systematic discrimination. Everything said in this room today is being recorded as evidence in that investigation. It was calculated risk. While James had filed complaints and been in contact with investigators, he deliberately implied their involvement was more advanced than it was. He watched Preston and Sarah carefully, waiting for their reaction. The executive nearest Preston leaned over to whisper urgently. Sarah's hands trembled as she shuffled papers. If there is some kind of investigation, which I doubt, Preston said carefully, it's irrelevant to today's proceeding, which concerns your specific conduct. James pressed forward. Ms. Morgan, you just testified under oath that you've never targeted other minority pilots. Would you like to amend that statement before I present documentation of 6 previous black pilots whose careers you helped end with nearly identical tactics? Sarah paled visibly. I never said. I was simply reporting legitimate safety concerns, like the concerns you expressed in emails to your uncle where you explicitly discussed strategies for removing pilots who didn't fit the traditional profile of Atlas aviators. Preston slammed his hand on the table. This meeting is suspended pending legal consultation. Captain Mitchell, you are dismissed. Actually, I'm not, James replied with quiet authority. Federal aviation regulations prohibit interference with an active safety investigation, which is what I've initiated regarding falsification of flight documents by Ms. Morgan. Another calculated move, invoking regulations that might not precisely apply, but creating enough uncertainty to keep proceedings going. James needed just a few more minutes. This is preposterous, Preston sputtered, composure finally cracking. There is no investigation. This is a transparent attempt to... The boardroom door opened, interrupting him mid-sentence. 2 men and a woman in business attire entered, displaying federal credentials. Robert Preston? I'm Special Agent Davis with the Department of Transportation Inspector General's Office. These are Agents Patel and Rodriguez. We're here as part of an ongoing investigation into allegations of discriminatory practices and safety protocol violations at Atlas Airlines. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. James had filed formal complaints weeks earlier but hadn't known if or when investigators would respond. His gambit in the meeting had been designed to unsettle Sarah and Preston enough to reveal something incriminating before any actual intervention. The arrival of federal agents now transformed his strategy from desperate bluff to masterstroke. Preston's face flushed crimson. This is a private corporate matter. You have no jurisdiction. Actually, we do, Agent Davis replied evenly. Airlines operate under federal certificates and are subject to federal civil rights laws. We have warrants to seize specific records related to pilot evaluation and disciplinary procedures. As he spoke, additional agents entered with document boxes and digital forensic equipment. Atlas executives looked to their legal counsel in panic. Sarah appeared on the verge of collapse. Ms. Morgan, Agent Patel approached her directly. We'd like to ask you some questions about communications between you and Mr. Preston regarding pilot evaluation criteria and reporting procedures. Something in Sarah snapped. Perhaps the pressure of the moment. Perhaps sudden realization she might face federal charges. Whatever the cause, she made a critical error. Uncle Robert only wanted to maintain standards, she blurted. He said the quality of pilots had declined since they started pushing diversity quotas. We were just protecting the industry's traditions. The room fell silent. Preston stared at his niece in disbelief, while James carefully controlled his expression. Sarah had just confessed to the conspiracy in front of federal agents and a room full of witnesses. Preston moved quickly to damage control. My niece is clearly distressed and confused. Any conversations were about legitimate safety and performance standards, not race. Then you won't mind us reviewing your communications, Agent Rodriguez replied. producing a warrant for Preston's company devices and accounts. Preston's hand moved subtly toward his jacket pocket where his phone was visible. Agent Davis noticed immediately. "Please don't touch your phone, Mr. Preston. Attempting to delete evidence would constitute obstruction." As federal agents began securing documents and devices, chaos erupted. Executives huddled with legal counsel. Sarah began sobbing quietly. Preston's face alternated between rage and calculation. In the midst of chaos, Sarah made her final play, desperation driving her to self-preservation. "It was all his idea," she said loudly, pointing at her uncle. "He told me which pilots to target. He said it was for the good of the airline. I was just following orders from a board member." Preston's face contorted with fury. "You treacherous little—" He caught himself, aware of agents documenting every word. James Washington stood calmly in the center of the storm he had created, watching years of systematic discrimination finally exposed to light. The struggle was far from over. Legal battles would surely follow. Preston's connections remained powerful, but the wall of silence had been irrevocably broken. As Agent Davis approached to take his formal statement, James caught a glimpse of David Harrison standing just outside the boardroom door, witnessing the unfolding scene. Their eyes met briefly. David gave a slight nod of respect, silent acknowledgement of the courage it had taken to stand against a system designed to crush individual resistance. Whatever happened next, nothing in commercial aviation would be quite the same again. Captain James Mitchell stood in the cockpit of Atlas Flight 1023, completing pre-flight checks with a meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his 20-year career. Outside, ground crews prepared the Boeing 787 for its journey from Boston to San Francisco. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into seats, unaware of the historic significance of this particular departure. This was James's first flight as captain since the events surrounding Flight 429, an ordeal that had transformed not just his career, but the landscape of commercial aviation itself. "External power connected, APU starting," reported First Officer David Harrison, who had specifically requested assignment as James's co-pilot for this flight. The young pilot had emerged as an unlikely but steadfast ally. "Thank you, David," James acknowledged, voice carrying the same quiet confidence it always had. The Department of Transportation had completed its initial investigation with stunning speed, uncovering evidence far beyond what even James had compiled. Sarah Morgan's public accusation against her uncle had opened floodgates, with numerous employees coming forward once they realized federal protection was available. Sarah herself had been fired within days. Federal charges for evidence tampering and making false statements during a federal investigation were pending, her attorneys desperately negotiating a plea deal in exchange for testimony against higher-level conspirators. Robert Preston had resigned from Atlas's board to focus on personal matters, according to the press release. The reality was far less dignified. His other business interests were now under scrutiny from multiple federal agencies, with particular focus on his pilot training companies and their history of discriminatory admission practices. Atlas Airlines found itself under a consent decree with the Department of Transportation, requiring comprehensive overhaul of hiring, promotion, and disciplinary procedures. External monitors now reviewed all pilot evaluations and personnel decisions for evidence of bias. Mandatory diversity training had been implemented across all management levels. Most significantly for James personally, he had been not merely reinstated, but promoted to the prestigious position of Chief Pilot for Training and Standards, a role giving him direct influence over the culture and practices that would shape the airline's future. "Captain Mitchell?" came a voice from the cabin doorway. A flight attendant stood with perfect posture, her uniform crisp, name tag reading Christine Taylor. "All passengers are boarded and we're ready for departure." She set a cup on the center console. "Also, your coffee. Black with 1 cream, exactly how you like it, Captain." The simple courtesy spoke volumes about the changing culture at Atlas. Word had spread throughout the crew network about what James had endured, and the reforms his stand had triggered. "Thank you, Christine," James replied with a warm smile. As they completed final preparations, James's phone chimed with a message. Checking quickly before powering down, he saw it was from General Richardson. "Congratulations on your return to the skies, Captain. The President has signed the executive order establishing the Transportation Equity Commission. Your appointment as Aviation Sector Representative will be announced next week." "Well done, son." James felt a surge of pride tinged with humility. The commission would have real power to address systematic discrimination across all transportation industries. His experience would help shape policies affecting thousands of professionals for decades to come. "Everything all right, Captain?" David asked, noting James's momentary distraction. "Better than all right, David," James replied, powering down his phone. "Let's fly." As the powerful engines spooled up and the aircraft began its pushback, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The false accusation on Flight 429 had nearly destroyed his career, but instead became the catalyst for industry-wide change. Zoe Williams had been reinstated with back pay and now headed Atlas's new diversity initiative, transforming her years of documenting discrimination into concrete reform proposals. Derek Simmons, the IT specialist, had received federal whistleblower protection and a new position with the FAA's Systems Integrity Division. Most surprisingly, several white pilots had approached James privately in recent weeks, sharing their own observations of discriminatory practices they'd witnessed, but felt powerless to challenge. The culture of silence was slowly giving way to one of accountability. "Atlas 1023, you are cleared for takeoff, runway 22 right," came the controller's voice through their headsets. "Atlas 1023 cleared for takeoff, 22 right," James confirmed, advancing the throttles smoothly. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, gathering speed for its ascent into clear blue skies, James felt a profound sense of closure. The battle had left scars, days and nights of doubt, personal attacks, moments when victory seemed impossible. But in persevering, he had accomplished something far greater than merely saving his own career. The plane lifted gracefully into the air, climbing away from Boston Logan Airport, where, just months earlier, he had been publicly humiliated and detained. Now he returned not as a victim, but as a pioneer. His vindication complete. His influence expanded beyond anything he could have imagined. Banking gently westward toward San Francisco, James gazed out at the limitless horizon. For a black boy who had grown up staring at planes overhead, dreaming of someday commanding one, the journey had been longer and harder than it should have been. But today, that journey continued on a trajectory that would help ensure others faced fewer barriers pursuing the same dream. "Passing through 10,000 feet, David reported. "Beautiful day for flying." "Indeed it is, First Officer Harrison," James replied with quiet satisfaction. "Indeed it is." As Atlas Flight 1023 climbed toward its cruising altitude, it carried not just passengers and cargo, but a powerful message about justice, perseverance, and the possibility of transforming even the most entrenched systems from within. For Captain James Mitchell, the sky had never looked more limitless, nor the future more promising. Have you ever witnessed discrimination in your workplace, or stood up against unfair treatment? We'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think differently about workplace discrimination, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about overcoming injustice. Share this video with someone who needs encouragement to stand up for what's right. Thank you for watching. Remember, real change happens when brave individuals refuse to accept discrimination as normal. Together, we can create workplaces and communities where everyone is judged by their character and competence, not by the color of their skin.